Hey guys, tonight we settle into a journey that begins not with Columbus stepping off a creaky ship in 1492, but with the lands he stumbled upon already alive with thousands of years of human history. You picture yourself standing on the banks of the Mississippi River, somewhere around. Smoke rises from hundreds of fires, the air rich with the smell of roasting maize and venison. Behind you monumental earthen mounds loom against the horizon, some shaped like flat-topped pyramids, others like animals stretching across the earth. The hum of drums carries through the night, steady and hypnotic, as men and women in elaborate shell ornaments and feathered headdresses move between wooden palisades and sprawling plazas. This isn't some lost wilderness waiting to be discovered. It's a world fully formed, complex and thriving, and if you're honest, you probably won't survive this first night out here. No GPS, no antibiotics, and you definitely don't know how to make a fire by rubbing sticks. But that's why you're here, because the civilizations of the Americas before Columbus weren't just tribes in forests. They built cities that rivaled medieval Europe, developed astronomical systems that rivaled anything in the old world, and cultivated crops that feed us today: potatoes, maize, beans, and chocolate. Tonight, we're going to walk among them. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying this calm space of history, remember to gently tap like and subscribe, because otherwise these mounds and pyramids will stay buried forever, and we can't let that happen. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Imagine sharing your local hour with people in places that were once homes to these great civilizations. It's kind of poetic, right? Alright, stretch out, relax, and let's drift deeper into the world of the Americas before Columbus. Time to leave behind the myth of a new world, and instead uncover the civilizations that had been here all along. You walk through this story with the understanding that long before European sails cut across the horizon, humans had already crossed ice and land bridges tens of thousands of years earlier. The peopling of the Americas, likely beginning around 15,000 years ago, though some sites point to even earlier arrivals, wasn't just a migration, it was the beginning of thousands of unique experiments in living. Picture families trudging across the Bering Land Bridge, wrapped in animal furs, carrying obsidian blades and the memory of campfires far to the west. They chased mammoth and bison, but also carried with them seeds of new traditions. Over millennia, those small groups fanned out across two vast continents. You imagine their roots like veins of life stretching through tundra, across plains into mountain valleys, down into tropical forests, and all the way to the windswept tip of Patagonia. Every environment shaped a new rhythm of survival. In the Arctic, people learned to read the ice, the snow and the movements of seals. In the desert Southwest, they became masters of water management. Along the Mississippi, they cultivated fertile floodplains until the land itself seemed to rise under their hands. This wasn't one civilization, it was thousands, each with its own languages, traditions and cosmologies. But together they proved something enormous, that human ingenuity could shape every environment on Earth, no matter how challenging. And here's the reality check. While medieval Europeans were stacking stones into Gothic cathedrals, people in the Americas were aligning their cities with solstices, mapping the heavens, and sustaining populations in the millions, all without the wheel, without draft animals like oxen or horses, and without metal tools in many regions. It's like building New York City using nothing sharper than stone, bone, or wood. Go ahead, try cutting down a tree with a sharpened rock. You'll need a week, and maybe a chiropractor. Let's zoom in on the diversity of these pre-Columbian worlds. In North America, you had mound-building cultures stretching from the Ohio River Valley to the Gulf of Mexico. Massive earthen structures rose where today you'd expect only small farming villages. These mounds weren't random heaps of dirt, they were engineered, often with astonishing precision, layered with different soils, clays and sands transported from miles away. Some served as burial sites, others as platforms for temples, houses of chiefs, or public rituals. If you were standing on top of one at sunset, you'd see the land roll out beneath you like a carefully drawn grid of human intention. Further south in Mesoamerica, civilizations like the Olmec, Maya, Zapotec, Mixtec, Toltec, and Aztec created cities of stone that dwarfed anything north of Mexico. Imagine walking through Teotihuacan in its prime around 500 CE, wide boulevards, the Pyramid of the Sun looming over 200 feet high, and murals painted in vivid reds and blues that made you dizzy if you stared too long. Thousands of people bustled in markets overflowing with obsidian blades, cacao beans used as money, and exotic feathers shimmering like trapped rainbows. In the Andes, the Incas built a road system stretching nearly 25,000 miles. Think about that. If you tried walking it today, you'd circle the entire Earth. The roads tied together highland fortresses, coastal fishing towns and mountain villages. Llamas trotted along carrying goods, runners sprinted messages across relay stations, and stone walls seemed to grow out of cliffs with joints so tight you couldn't slip a blade of grass between them. No mortar, no steel, just precise craftsmanship, centuries of knowledge and maybe a little bit of backbreaking labor. And let's not forget the Amazon. For years Europeans dismissed it as an untouched wilderness. But archaeology now reveals networks of raised fields, causeways, fish weirs, and even massive geoglyphs carved into the forest floor. You're looking at a managed landscape, not a virgin jungle. Millions may have lived there before disease and conquest swept through, erasing entire societies. The forest you see today is partly regrown, a ghost of civilizations that once farmed, burned and built in harmony with the rhythms of rain and river. These societies weren't isolated. Long before the internet, or even medieval trade caravans, they created webs of connections stretching thousands of miles. Shell beads from the Gulf of Mexico turn up in the Great Lakes, turquoise from the American Southwest shows up in central Mexico, feathers from tropical parrots traveled north into dry desert villages where the birds couldn't possibly survive. Trade wasn't just about goods, it was about stories, myths, and prestige. When you held a shell from the faraway sea, you also held the weight of distant people's rituals and powers. Religion was woven into everything: the sun, the stars, mountains, rivers, all living forces that demanded respect. Priests and shamans read omens in the flight of birds, or the alignments of stars. Ceremonies marked the turning of seasons, the planting of maize, the sacrifices that ensured rain, and yes, some of those sacrifices were human. Imagine standing in a plaza as drums beat and incense clouds sting your eyes. The crowd watches, tense, believing the blood about to flow is the thread keeping the cosmos together. You shift uncomfortably because, let's be real, you're not signing up to be part of that ritual. You like the food and the festivals, but maybe not the possible death on a pyramid part. Yet what strikes you isn't just the strangeness, it's the universality. Across oceans, in different languages and landscapes, people were wrestling with the same questions. How do we feed ourselves? How do we make sense of the stars? How do we build something that lasts longer than our own fragile bodies? And across the Americas they answered those questions with monumental earth, stone and stories that survive even when the builders are long gone. Think of it this way: by the time Columbus arrived, there were more people living in the Americas than in Europe. Cities like Tenochtitlan may have had populations larger than London. Farmers here had domesticated maize, potatoes, beans, squash, and chili peppers, the crops that would eventually reshape global diets. Imagine Europe without potatoes or Italy without tomatoes. You can't. The so-called New World fed the old, and the balance of global history tipped. But for tonight, before contact, you linger in this moment. You stand amid the fires, the chants, the pyramids and mounds. The air tastes of corn, beer and roasted peppers. The night sky glitters with stars mapped by priests who know exactly where Venus will rise. And you realize the story of America didn't begin in 1492. It was already ancient. Word count, 3.
Awaiting. Continue.
You shuffle your feet along a packed earth path that stretches across a wide plain, and soon you're staring at an enormous earthwork rising like an unnatural hill. Welcome to the world of the mound builders, people who for more than 2,000 years shaped the landscapes of North America into ceremonial centers, burial grounds and monumental symbols of their power. You might have thought pyramids were only a thing in Egypt or Mexico, but no, these were built right here, centuries before Europeans even dreamed of crossing the Atlantic. And in case you're wondering, no bulldozers were involved, just baskets of dirt, carried one after another by the thousands. If you've ever complained about carrying groceries up a flight of stairs, imagine hauling soil mile after mile, one load at a time. Suddenly your local supermarket trip doesn't seem so tough. The earliest mound building traditions, like the Adena culture around 1000 BCE in the Ohio Valley, left behind conical mounds that often held elaborate burials. When archaeologists opened some of these sites, they discovered not just skeletons, but also intricate grave goods, pipes carved from stone into animal shapes, sheets of copper hammered into ornaments, beads made from marine shells. These weren't trinkets, they were status symbols. You can almost picture mourners standing by the mound, the smoke of fires drifting upward, as chiefs and spiritual leaders were interred with goods meant to carry them into another world. But the Adena weren't just about death, they were part of a living network of villages, scattered across river valleys, sustained by hunting, gathering, and early farming. Over time, their influence merged into the Hopewell tradition, which between about 200 BCE and 500 CE, produced earthworks of jaw-dropping scale and precision. Imagine walking into a clearing and seeing vast geometric shapes, circles, squares, octagons, carved into the land itself, some stretching over hundreds of acres. From the ground you might not grasp the full picture, but climb a nearby rise, and you'd realize these weren't random. They were carefully designed, aligned with solstices and lunar cycles. You're basically standing inside an ancient observatory, one where astronomy and spirituality meet. The Hopewell weren't just backyard stargazers though, they were master traders. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, mica from the Appalachians, copper from the Great Lakes, and shells from the Gulf Coast all flowed into Hopewell centers. The sheer spread of these materials suggests networks covering much of the continent. Picture it, a necklace carved from a conch shell pulled from warm southern waters, ends up around the neck of a person buried in cold Ohio soil. It's not just trade, it's cultural exchange, mythologies carried hand to hand across hundreds of miles. Fast forward a few centuries, and you stumble upon the Mississippian culture, which flourished from about 800 to 1600 CE. Now the mounds are bigger, the plazas larger, the populations denser. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, becomes the epicenter of this world. But before we get into Cahokia's jaw-dropping scale, don't worry, we'll walk its plazas soon. Let's pause on what made the Mississippian lifestyle tick. At its heart was maize agriculture. By domesticating and cultivating maize, people unlocked the calories needed to sustain tens of thousands in one settlement. You know that feeling when you discover instant noodles in your cupboard at 2 a.m., that sense of survival and abundance. Multiply that by thousands of households, and you get the agricultural backbone of Mississippian life. Fields stretched outward from towns, fertilized by river floods, and harvests filled communal storage pits. Mississippian societies also developed stratified social systems. Chiefs claimed divine authority, believed to act as intermediaries between humans and gods. Their power wasn't just political, it was cosmic. When a chief gave orders, he wasn't just enforcing rules, he was maintaining balance in the universe. So yes, disobeying him might get you punished, but more importantly it might anger the spirits who made the crops grow. That's some next-level leadership strategy. Combine politics with cosmic terror, and suddenly everyone shows up to work on time. Ceremonial life pulsed in the plazas between mounds. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of others during a ritual ball game, or during a green corn ceremony marking renewal and balance. Smoke rises, chants echo, and drums pound as dancers whirl, their costumes shimmering with feathers and shells. The air smells of roasted maize and earthy sweat. You feel the ground vibrate beneath your feet, the rhythm pulling you into something larger than yourself. And for a fleeting moment you realize these were not primitive gatherings. They were cultural spectacles rivaling medieval festivals in Europe. One iconic element of Mississippian culture was the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a shared set of symbols found across artifacts from Florida to Illinois: falcons, serpents, warriors in elaborate regalia. These motifs suggest a unifying cosmology, a language of symbols that transcended regional differences. Think of it like medieval Christian iconography spreading across cathedrals. You didn't need words to know what the symbols meant. They spoke to power, to the divine, to warfare, to fertility. As you wander through these worlds, you can't help but notice the effort required, the sheer manpower, organization, and shared belief systems needed to pile millions of baskets of dirt into precise formations boggles the mind. Some mounds contained more earth than the Great Pyramid of Giza contains stone. Stop and think about that. People here with no beasts of burden, no wheels, no steel tools, pulled off feats on par with the wonders of the old world. And yet, despite their grandeur, much remains mysterious. Why did some centers, like those of the Hopewell, fade? Why did mound building rise and fall in waves, reappearing centuries later? Archaeologists propose climate shifts, overuse of resources, conflict, or simply cultural transformation. But whatever the causes, the earthworks remain, silent witnesses of societies that thrived, faltered, and were reborn in new forms. Here's a cheeky thought. If you'd been a European explorer stumbling onto one of these sites in the 1500s, you might have assumed aliens built them. Spoiler alert, they didn't. It was humans. Humans with grit, vision and a lot of free time. The fact that some early European settlers couldn't imagine Native Americans had the capacity to build these monuments says more about colonial bias than about the builders themselves. The mound builders force you to reconsider what civilization means. It isn't always about stone skyscrapers or written scripts. Sometimes it's about reshaping the land, embedding your cosmology into earth and clay, leaving behind landscapes that speak across centuries. Even today, when highways roar nearby and suburbs sprawl across old floodplains, the mounds remain, quiet but defiant reminders that America had its own monumental traditions long before Columbus arrived. And so you leave one mound behind, the night settling around you, but the vision of Earth rising against the sky stays etched in your mind. You realize that underfoot, across the continent, traces of these builders still ripple through the soil, foundations of a story far older than the myth of a new world. You step onto a broad, open plaza, and it feels like the air itself hums with memory. Before you stretches Cahokia, the largest and most complex pre-Columbian city north of Mexico. It's around 150 CE, and you are standing in the heart of a metropolis that rivals London or Paris in size. At its peak, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 people lived here, and tens of thousands more filled the surrounding countryside. That may not sound huge by modern standards, but in a medieval world where most European towns were muddy, overcrowded and reeking of sewage, Cahokia stands as a marvel of urban design and social organization. You look up, and there it is, Monk's Mound, the largest earthen pyramid in the Americas, rising 100 feet high and covering more than 14 acres at its base. It dominates the skyline. From the top, the view stretches across the Mississippi floodplain. Imagine the work that went into building it, an estimated 22 million cubic feet of earth carried basket by basket. To give you perspective, that's like trying to fill a football stadium with nothing but dirt, except you have no wheelbarrows, no trucks, no backhoes, just shoulders, hands, and the determination of a society bound by belief and hierarchy. Honestly, you'd probably give up after 3 baskets and fake a sprained ankle. Cahokia wasn't just a big dirt pile with some houses scattered around, it was a planned city. Archaeological evidence shows carefully laid out neighborhoods, broad ceremonial plazas, and a wood henge, a circle of massive wooden posts, aligned to track solstices and equinoxes. If you're picturing Stonehenge, but in wood and with way more splinters, you've got the idea. Imagine priests standing in the circle, marking the exact moment the sun rose on the summer solstice, their observations guiding planting and harvest cycles. It's astronomy, religion, and civic order rolled into one. The city pulsed with activity. Farmers from surrounding villages streamed in with maize, beans, and squash to supply the urban population. Traders arrived carrying shells, copper, obsidian, and mica. Artisans chipped away at chart to make blades, carved effigy pipes, and hammered copper into ornaments that gleamed in the sun. The smell of smoke, roasting maize, and human sweat filled the air, and somewhere nearby a child ran barefoot through the dust while dogs barked and chickens, yes, actual chickens hadn't arrived yet, so scratch that, while turkeys strutted and gobbled around the courtyards. At the center of Cahokia's political life was the ruler, sometimes referred to as the Great Sun. His authority was both earthly and divine. He lived atop Monk's Mound, his residence elevated above the common people in both a literal and symbolic sense. To climb up and meet him, you'd need to ascend a massive staircase, each step reinforcing your awareness of his power. Below, people gathered in the plazas, watching rituals, games, and ceremonies that reinforced the cosmic order. And let's talk about those games. The Cahokians, like many native cultures, played chunky, a game where players rolled a stone disc across the ground and tried to land their spears as close to its final position as possible. Think of it as darts meets bowling but with higher stakes. This wasn't just recreation, it was ritual. Political outcomes, alliances, and social hierarchies were sometimes tied to the results. Picture the tension. The crowd leans forward, breath held, as the chunky stone skids across the dust. Spears fly, dust kicks up, and the winner isn't just bragging for the night. He might be shifting the balance of power in the region, and here you are, still struggling to throw a frisbee straight. Religion permeated Cahokian life. Temples atop mounds connected the people to their gods and ancestors. Sacrificial rituals, including human sacrifice, likely played a role in reinforcing authority and cosmic order. Archaeologists excavating Mound 72 discovered a burial site with over 250 individuals, including dozens of young women, who appear to have been sacrificed. Sobering, yes, but also a stark reminder that power was maintained through spectacle and violence, as much as through agriculture and trade. If you're shuffling nervously at the edge of the crowd, that's understandable. The message is clear: the rulers could command not only life but also death. Cahokia's reach extended far beyond its city limits. Trade goods from across the continent have been found here: copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from Appalachia, obsidian from the Rockies. It was a hub, a magnet pulling in resources and ideas, redistributing them across a wide sphere of influence. When you walked its streets, you weren't just in a local city, you were standing in the heartbeat of a regional system, its rhythms tied to rivers, trade and the cycles of maize. But like all great cities, Cahokia had its shadows. Crowding led to sanitation issues, and skeletal remains reveal signs of malnutrition, disease and violence. Elites lived well, but commoners bore the burdens of labor and scarcity. You'd see inequality carved into the landscape itself: elite houses atop mounds, common dwellings clustered in lower, flood-prone areas. It's the classic story of civilization: the higher the leaders rise, the harder the workers strain to keep them there. By around 1350, Cahokia began to decline. The reasons are debated: climate shifts leading to shorter growing seasons, soil exhaustion, deforestation, social unrest, or external conflict. Maybe it was all of the above. What you know is this: the plazas grew quieter, the mounds eroded, the wood-henge posts rotted away, the people dispersed, the city faded, and what had once been a metropolis became an abandoned landscape, its grandeur swallowed by grass and silence. By the time Europeans arrived centuries later, Cahokia was already a ghost. And yet, the earth still remembers. Stand at the base of Monk's Mound today, and you can feel the weight of history pressing down, whispering of thousands of lives lived, of rituals performed, of maize planted and harvested, of games played and blood spilled. It's humbling to realize that 1,000 years ago, this was the center of a world that most modern Americans have never even heard of. Here's a cheeky thought to leave you with: when you next drive past a random hill or bump in the ground, resist the urge to dismiss it, because who knows, it might just be the buried remains of a lost city, the kind that once rivaled London, the kind that could turn your whole understanding of history on its head. And no, you don't need to grab a shovel right now. Let the archaeologists handle it. You've got enough trouble just keeping your backyard weed-free. Cahokia forces you to confront the truth. Civilization in the Americas wasn't waiting for Columbus. It had already risen, thrived, and fallen, leaving behind landscapes shaped by human ambition. The mounds remain, silent but massive, reminders that greatness is not the property of any one continent. You move southwest, the land growing drier, the horizon stretching into mesas and canyons painted in layers of red, gold and ochre. This is the world of the ancestral Puebloans, once called the Anasazi, though that term is fading now because it comes from a Navajo word meaning ancient enemies. Here, in the deserts and high plateaus of what's now New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and Utah, people carved communities into stone itself. You step into Chaco Canyon, around the year 1100 CE, and it feels like walking into a place designed as much for the heavens as for the earth. Great houses rise before you, massive stone masonry buildings with hundreds of rooms, stacked 3 or 4 stories high, shaped like giant Ds or rectangles. Pueblo Bonito, the most famous, sprawls over 2 acres, with more than 600 rooms and dozens of kivas, circular underground chambers used for ceremonies. You tilt your head back, tracing the neat courses of sandstone blocks, perfectly shaped and fitted without mortar. Some walls are still standing 30 feet high, their edges sharp against the sky. The sheer labor of it is staggering. Thousands of beams of timber were hauled from forests 50 miles away. No wagons, no horses, no trucks, just human back. If you've ever struggled carrying a bag of groceries up a staircase, imagine dragging a 16-foot pine log across desert and canyon, and you thought IKEA furniture was a nightmare. Life here wasn't just about architecture, it was about cosmology. Chaco Canyon was carefully aligned with the sun, moon and stars. On the summer solstice, a shaft of light passes through a spiral petroglyph at Fachada Butte, marking the day with eerie precision. You imagine shamans and astronomers standing silently waiting for that beam of light to strike, their authority cemented by the heavens themselves. The whole canyon seems built to echo celestial rhythms, as if the people weren't just living on the land, but weaving their lives into the fabric of the cosmos. But don't picture this as a city full of permanent residents bustling like New York. Chaco may have been more like a ceremonial center, a place where thousands gathered seasonally for rituals, trade, and feasts, then dispersed back to their villages. Picture the roads, yes, roads, radiating outward from Chaco in straight lines that sometimes cut across mesas, canyons, and cliffs. They weren't always practical, some seemed designed more for symbolism than utility. A road marching straight into the horizon suggests not just movement of people but movement of spirit, a connection between places both earthly and sacred. Trade networks thrived here. Macaw feathers from tropical Mexico, seashells from the Pacific, turquoise mined from local hills, all found their way into Chaco. Runners and traders must have carried goods across staggering distances, linking the desert with jungles and oceans. When you see a bright scarlet macaw feather in the hands of a Chacoan priest, you're not just seeing wealth, you're seeing proof of networks stretching across a continent. Ceremonial life revolved around the kivas. You descend into one cool and shadowy, the smell of smoke clinging to the plastered walls. The sipapu, a small hole in the floor, represents the portal through which the ancestors emerged from the underworld. Ritual fires crackle, drums echo, chants rise, and dancers stamp in time, their shadows flickering on the walls. You feel the pull of community, the sense that in this space, earth and sky, past and present, all meet, and then someone next to you coughs, reminding you that, yes, the smoke inhalation must have been brutal. Daily life wasn't easy. Farming in the desert meant carefully managing scarce water. The ancestral Puebloans built check dams, canals and reservoirs to capture rainfall and runoff. Fields of maize, beans and squash lined arroyos and terraces. Every drop mattered. You bend down and scoop up a handful of dusty soil, realizing how much ingenuity it took to coax crops from such a dry land. Survival was a daily balancing act, with drought always looming as a threat. By the 1200s, something shifted. Chaco's influence waned, and people began moving into cliff dwellings like those at Mesa Verde. You climb a narrow trail, and find yourself staring at a village tucked into a sandstone alcove, its rooms stacked like a puzzle against the cliff. Cliff Palace, the largest, holds over 150 rooms and more than 20 kivas, nestled under a natural rock overhang that shields it from rain and snow. Imagine the drama of daily life here. Children scrambling up ladders, women grinding maize on metates, smoke curling into the canyon air, men repairing walls or carving tools from stone, and at night, the stars blanket the sky while coyotes howl from the mesa tops. Why the shift to the cliffs? Scholars debate: drought, resource depletion, social conflict, or spiritual change. Maybe people sought more defensible positions as pressures mounted. Maybe the cliffs offered protection in turbulent times. Whatever the reason, by the late 1200s, many of these cliff dwellings were abandoned. Families migrated south and east, joining other Pueblo groups. The Hopi, Zuni, and Rio Grande Pueblo peoples of today trace their ancestry back to these very places. For them, Chaco and Mesa Verde aren't ruins, they're sacred landscapes, living links to ancestral stories. Archaeology gives you the walls, the tools, the bones, but oral tradition gives you something more, the understanding that these weren't vanished peoples, but ancestors who still whisper in ceremonies, dances and prayers. When Hopi elders speak of migration, of journeys guided by the spirits, they're echoing the very footsteps you're trying to follow tonight. Here's your cheeky reality check. If you tried to live a single week in Chaco Canyon, you'd probably tap out on day 2, grinding maize for hours on end, hauling water, hauling wood, hauling stone, dealing with smoke-filled rooms and constant drought. It wasn't exactly spa life, yet these people endured, not just endured, but thrived, building monuments that still stand 1,000 years later. Meanwhile, your modern apartment walls crumble if you hang one too many shelves. The ancestral Puebloans remind you that civilization isn't always about kings on thrones or sprawling empires. Sometimes it's about aligning stone with starlight, carving homes into cliffs, and sustaining life where the desert seems to offer none. As you leave the canyon, the silhouettes of great houses fade into the dusk, but the echo of drums, the whisper of wind through kivas, and the shimmer of distant macaw feathers stay with you. These were not lost people. They are still here, their descendants alive, their voices woven into the desert wind. You leave the dry mesas of the southwest and drift farther south into the lush jungles and swampy lowlands of what is now Veracruz and Tabasco in Mexico. The air is thick with humidity, the buzzing of insects constant, the smell of damp earth rising as though the ground itself is alive. This is the homeland of the Olmec, a people whose culture thrived from around 1500 BCE to 400 BCE and who are often described as the mother culture of Mesoamerica. Whether or not they were truly the first to shape everything that followed is still debated, but one thing is clear: when you step into an Olmec ceremonial center, you know you are in the presence of something foundational. You walk into San Lorenzo, one of their earliest and most impressive centers. The ground undulates with raised platforms and artificial ridges, evidence of a landscape deliberately reshaped. These weren't casual villages, this was urban planning, centuries before anyone in Europe even knew this land existed. The rulers of San Lorenzo built complex drainage systems using basalt channels to control water, which shimmered in the sun as it moved through plazas and courtyards. The sound of running water mingling with ritual chants must have been hypnotic, and yes, they had running water before most medieval Europeans. Let that sink in the next time your shower runs cold. Then you see them, colossal heads, carved from massive basalt boulders, each weighing up to 40 tons. They stare at you with almond-shaped eyes, flat noses, and helmet-like headgear. Some are nearly 10 feet tall. You can't help but freeze. How did they move these stones across swamps and rivers without wheels or beasts of burden? The answer is simple: human muscle, sheer organization, and a belief so powerful it made the impossible happen. Workers likely dragged these boulders with ropes and log rollers, chanting in unison, sweat pouring down their bodies under the unforgiving sun. And here you are, out of breath after walking up one flight of stairs. The faces on the colossal heads are distinct, suggesting they represent rulers rather than gods. Imagine standing in the plaza, the real ruler seated nearby, the carved visage looming behind him like a stone echo of his authority. The message is unmistakable: power here isn't just temporary, it is eternal, literally carved into stone. You're not just bowing to a man, you're bowing to a dynasty. But the Olmec weren't only about giant rocks and sweaty workers, they developed intricate religious iconography, symbols that would ripple across later Mesoamerican cultures. The were-jaguar, a fusion of human and jaguar features, shows up again and again. Maybe it represented shamanic transformation, maybe rain or fertility, maybe the raw, untamable power of the jungle. Whatever the meaning, the motif stuck, echoed later by the Maya and Aztecs in their pantheons of gods and monsters. They also played the Mesoamerican ball game, the ancestor of all later versions. Picture a stone court, players bouncing a heavy rubber ball off their hips, trying to send it through stone rings mounted high on the walls. The game wasn't just entertainment, it was cosmic theater, a reenactment of mythic battles between life and death, day and night. Sometimes the stakes were literal life and death for the players themselves. You glance at the heavy ball and think, even if you survived, your hips would never forgive you. Olmec art reveals a culture steeped in symbolism. Jade figurines gleam in green-blue hues, their polished surfaces catching the light. Masks carved from serpentine and basalt show stylized faces with downturned mouths and piercing eyes. These weren't trinkets for tourists, they were ritual objects, placed in burials, offerings, or sacred caches. Each one told a story about origins, gods, and the role of humans in the cosmos. Agriculture underpinned it all. The Olmec cultivated maize, beans, squash, and manioc, feeding their growing populations, but they also drew wealth from their environment: rubber from tree sap, cacao for ritual drinks, obsidian for blades, and jade for prestige goods. Their centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, functioned as hubs where rulers commanded labor, directed ceremonies, and orchestrated trade. La Venta, rising after San Lorenzo's decline, offers another vision of Olmec grandeur. Its core was dominated by a pyramid, 11 feet high, built entirely of earth. Around it, courtyards and platforms spread out, flanked by colossal heads, altars, and intricate mosaics made of serpentine blocks arranged in symbolic designs. One mosaic, carefully buried beneath layers of earth, was never meant to be seen by human eyes again. It was an offering to the gods, a gift sealed away forever. You can almost picture the ritual: hundreds of people gathered, priests chanting, incense smoke thick in the air, and then the slow, deliberate burial of an artwork destined not for human admiration but for divine approval. The Olmec also left behind the earliest evidence of writing in Mesoamerica, the Cascajal block, a slab inscribed with strange glyphs, hints at a system of communication that may have influenced later scripts like the Maya hieroglyphs. Their calendar systems and astronomical observations likely set the stage for the precision of later civilizations. Imagine priests tracking the stars through the jungle canopy, aligning ceremonies with celestial events. You know the stereotype, ancient people gazing up at the sky, but these weren't idle stargazers, they were mathematicians, astronomers, and prophets rolled into one. Socially, the Olmec world revolved around elites, who claimed sacred authority. Their ability to marshal labor for colossal heads, pyramids, and causeways shows they weren't mere chiefs of villages, but rulers of organized states. The common people farmed, fished and labored, their work channeling into monumental projects that gave meaning to their rulers' cosmic claims. Religion wasn't separate from politics, it was politics. If you didn't show up to carry your basket of dirt or haul your log, you weren't just defying the king, you were defying the gods. Good luck explaining that at dinner. By 400 BCE, Olmec centers were in decline. San Lorenzo fell first, then La Venta, its pyramids slowly eroding, its colossal heads buried by time and vegetation. The causes remain murky: environmental stress, internal strife, shifting trade routes, or natural disasters. Whatever the reasons, the Olmec legacy endured. Later civilizations picked up their symbols, their ballgame, their monumental style. The Maya, Zapotec and Aztec all carried echoes of the Olmec into their own worlds. Think of the Olmec as the deep roots of a tree. You don't always see them, but without them, the trunk and branches above couldn't stand. They laid down the patterns, ritual kingship, sacred ball courts, monumental art, that later peoples would refine, expand and in some cases, surpass. Yet even today, when you stand in front of one of those colossal heads, staring into the calm, heavy-lidded eyes of a ruler long gone, you feel the weight of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Here's the cheeky reality check. If you were plopped into San Lorenzo as a laborer, your job description would probably read something like, haul rock, don't complain, maybe don't get sacrificed. But if you were lucky enough to be an elite, well, congratulations, you'd be immortalized in basalt, your face staring down strangers 3,000 years later. Not a bad retirement plan. So you leave the jungle behind, ears still ringing with the echoes of chants, eyes filled with the massive gaze of stone rulers, and you realize, the Olmec weren't just the beginning, they were the foundation, the blueprint, the first whispers of a story that would stretch across centuries and civilizations. And their colossal heads, still sitting in the jungle, moss, hoops across their brows, remind you that some legacies really are carved in stone. The jungle closes in thicker now, a green wall of life, but hidden beneath its canopy lies one of the most dazzling civilizations of the ancient world, the Maya. Tonight you wander into their realm, a place of stepped pyramids, stone stelae etched with glyphs, and cities that gleamed like jewels across the lowlands of modern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. From about 250 CE to 900 CE, the classic period, the Maya built a civilization whose achievements in writing, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture rival anything from Greece, Rome, or China. And no, they weren't just jungle dwellers with funny calendars, they were astronomer priests, kings, farmers, warriors, artists, and mathematicians who mapped both the heavens and the human soul. You step into Tikal, one of their great cities, and the skyline stops you in your tracks. Temples rise like stone mountains, their staircases climbing toward the sky, their tops crowned with shrines where fires burn for the gods. The tallest, Temple 5, stands over 200 feet high, taller than most medieval cathedrals. Imagine climbing those steep stairs, your legs shaking, your lungs burning in the humid air, while the jungle spreads endlessly below and howler monkeys roar like lions in the canopy. At the top, a priest in feathered regalia waits, obsidian blade glinting in the sun, incense smoke curling around him. This is not a casual Sunday service, this is cosmic theater. The Maya believed their kings were divine intermediaries, the living axis between the human world and the gods. Every victory in war, every successful harvest, every celestial alignment required rituals led by these rulers. One common practice was bloodletting, nobles piercing their tongues or genitals, letting their blood drip onto paper which was then burned, the smoke carrying their sacrifice skyward. It sounds brutal, and yes it was, but it was also a demonstration of devotion. Imagine your local politician trying to win votes that way. You'd definitely remember their campaign. But the Maya weren't only about spectacle, their writing system was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, carved into stone monuments, painted in codices, or incised into pottery. Their glyphs combined logograms, words, and syllabic signs. With this script, they recorded dynastic histories, rituals, astronomical events, and even playful jokes on ceramics. For centuries, scholars struggled to crack the code, but today we can read the voices of Maya kings, boasting of their conquests, scribes signing their artwork, and priests recording celestial cycles with precision that makes modern astronomers nod in respect. And let's talk about that calendar. Forget the 2012 doomsday memes. The Maya calendar was a complex system combining several cycles, the 2060-day sacred calendar, Kin, interlocked with the 3065-day solar calendar Hub, creating a 52-year calendar round. On top of that, the long count tracked dates across thousands of years. Imagine being able to place an event, not just in a year but in a cycle stretching back to mythic creation. You scroll through your phone's calendar app, and it barely handles a decade. The Maya were scheduling rituals in 400-year cycles. Mathematics underpinned it all. The Maya independently invented the concept of 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. Their vigesimal base 20 number system allowed them to make precise astronomical calculations. With just dots and bars they could compute planetary movements, predict eclipses, and align temples with solstices. Standing in front of an observatory at Uxmal or Chichen Itza, you realize these weren't just temples, they were instruments, stone machines for tracking the cosmos. Speaking of Chichen Itza, picture the Great Pyramid known as El Castillo. On the spring and autumn equinoxes, shadows fall on the staircase in such a way that a serpent seems to slither down the pyramid's side. Crowds must have gasped as the feathered serpent god, Kukulkan, appeared in living shadow. It wasn't magic, it was math, architecture, and astronomy fused into a spectacle that reinforced belief. It's basically the ancient version of special effects, except without CGI. Life for the common Maya was less glamorous. Most people were farmers, tending milpas, fields of maize, beans and squash, grown together in complementary cycles. They hunted deer, fished rivers and raised turkeys and dogs. Houses of thatched roofs and mud walls clustered around courtyards, while larger households supported craft specialists, producing jade jewelry, obsidian blades, or painted ceramics. The elite feasted on cacao drinks, whipped into frothy chocolate, while commoners ate maize tortillas and stews. And yes, chocolate was sacred. Imagine a world where your morning hot cocoa was literally a gift from the gods. Honestly, you're a little jealous. Maya warfare was constant, and not just for territory. Capturing prisoners was crucial for rituals. Kings needed captives for sacrifices that validated their power. Imagine warriors leaping into battle, obsidian-tipped spears flashing, shields painted with snarling jaguars, their goal not just to kill, but to seize. Prisoners were paraded, humiliated, and eventually offered on temple altars. It's brutal, but for the Maya, it was cosmic necessity. Life and death fed the cycle of maize and sun. But even civilizations built on cosmic order face collapse. By the late 800s and 900s, many great Maya cities in the southern lowlands, Tikal, Copan, Palenque, were abandoned. Theories abound: drought, overpopulation, soil exhaustion, warfare, political upheaval. Perhaps it was all at once, a perfect storm unraveling centuries of brilliance. Imagine being a farmer watching crops wither, wars drag on, rulers demand more sacrifices, and wondering if the gods had turned their backs. Slowly, plazas emptied, temples fell silent, and the jungle reclaimed the stone. Yet, the Maya did not disappear. Northern cities like Chichen Itza and Mayapan flourished later, and even after Spanish conquest, millions of Maya people endured. Today, Maya languages are still spoken, rituals still practiced, communities still thriving across Mesoamerica. To them, their ancestors' cities are not ruins but living places, infused with memory and meaning. Here's your reality check. If you'd lived as a Maya farmer, your life was backbreaking. Up before dawn, tending maize, offering prayers and maybe coughing in a smoky hut. If you were elite, you might end up immortalized in glyphs or jade, but also expected to pierce your tongue and bleed for the cosmos. Either way, life wasn't easy, but it was rich, complex, and deeply tied to a vision of the universe where every act, planting a seed, sacrificing a captive, watching the stars, kept the cosmic order alive. When you step away from a Maya city, the jungle quickly swallows the stones, but the sense of awe remains. You've walked among astronomers who tracked Venus, artists who painted glyphs that still speak today, kings who bled for the gods, and farmers who fed it all. And you realize the Maya weren't just a lost civilization. They are still here, their descendants alive, their voices echoing in every temple stone and whispered prayer. You leave the Maya lowlands behind and step into the broad valley of Mexico, where a city once rose so vast and so carefully planned that its very name became legendary, Teotihuacan. By around 100 CE this city began to grow, and by 500 CE it had become one of the largest urban centers in the world, home to perhaps 100,000, 200,000 people. That's bigger than most European cities at the time, and it wasn't a random sprawl of huts and shacks. No, Teotihuacan was laid out like a cosmic diagram, its grid of streets and monumental pyramids aligned with the stars, the sun, and the very heartbeat of the universe. You walk down the Avenue of the Dead, a massive boulevard stretching for miles, lined with platforms, temples and palaces. Ahead towers the Pyramid of the Sun, one of the largest structures in the Americas, 20-30 feet high, with a base covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Imagine climbing its steep stairs, each step reminding you that this was no casual jog. At the top, the wind whips around you, the valley spreads out below and you feel the weight of thousands of lives converging in ceremony and ritual. The pyramid wasn't just a pile of stone, it was a mountain of meaning, a man-made sacred landscape meant to connect the human and divine. Nearby stands the Pyramid of the Moon, anchoring the north end of the avenue. Behind it looms Cerro Gordo, a real mountain, creating a mirrored effect, natural peak and man-made pyramid side by side, as if the builders were saying, "We can remake the world in stone." Along the avenue are smaller platforms, where rituals, sacrifices and processions played out. When you picture Teotihuacan in its prime, don't imagine a grey ruin, imagine plastered walls painted bright red, murals alive with jaguars, serpents, gods and priests. Color and movement filled this city. You'd hear chants, smell incense, and feel drums beating in your chest. The city wasn't just about pyramids. Residential compounds housed thousands, often arranged around courtyards with kitchens, workshops and altars. Murals in these compounds showed jaguar warriors, priests and abstract deities. Some compounds specialized in crafts. Obsidian workshops produced blades sharper than steel. Pottery workshops turned out thin orange ceramics, prized across Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan wasn't only a religious center, it was an industrial and economic hub. Trade routes stretched out in all directions, bringing in turquoise from the north, shells from the Gulf, cacao from the tropics, and feathers from faraway jungles. And then there's the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, also known as the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. Excavations here revealed rows of sculpted serpent heads and shells, their gaping mouths frozen in stone. But beneath the pyramid, archaeologists found something darker, mass graves of warriors, many with their hands bound, sacrificed and buried as offerings. It's chilling, but it tells you something crucial. Teotihuacan's grandeur was built not only on trade and planning but also on ritual violence, the spilling of blood to sustain the cosmos. You shift uncomfortably, because you know you wouldn't last long here if chosen as an offering, unless you're into obsidian blade neck massages, in which case congratulations. The political structure of Teotihuacan remains a mystery. Unlike the Maya, who loved to carve the names of kings into stone, Teotihuacan left no obvious record of individual rulers. Some scholars think it was ruled by a council, others that kingship existed, but was expressed collectively rather than personally. Whatever the case, the city's power projected far beyond its valley. Murals and artifacts in Maya cities like Tikal show Teotihuacan warriors and emissaries arriving, imposing their influence hundreds of miles away. To the Maya, Teotihuacan wasn't just another city, it was the metropolis, the great power of the highlands. Religion here revolved around deities like the feathered serpent and the storm god, later known as Tlaloc. Water, fertility, warfare, and cosmic cycles dominated rituals. Temples aligned with astronomical events, especially Venus, whose appearances marked times of war and sacrifice. Imagine priests watching the sky, calculating the moment when Venus rose, then leading processions to the pyramids, firelight flickering on murals, incense thick in the air. To live in Teotihuacan was to live inside a cosmic machine, each stone aligned with forces beyond human control. But no city lasts forever. By the 6th century, Teotihuacan began to decline. Evidence suggests internal strife. Palaces were burned, murals defaced, elites toppled. Maybe drought strained resources, maybe class conflict boiled over, maybe rival factions tore the city apart. By 750 CE, Teotihuacan was largely abandoned, its pyramids looming over silent plazas. For centuries afterward, later peoples, the Toltecs, the Aztecs, looked on its ruins with awe. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were made. They believed it was here, among the pyramids, that the sun and moon were born, that the cosmos was renewed. Here's your cheeky reminder: if you lived here, you'd either be hauling obsidian, grinding maize, or nervously checking if your number was up for sacrifice. But you'd also be part of one of the most dazzling cities the world had ever seen. Your daily grind, literally grinding maize, was woven into a cosmic drama that turned stone into mountains and streets into the paths of gods. Even in ruin, Teotihuacan whispers of its scale and mystery. You can still walk the Avenue of the Dead today, your footsteps echoing where thousands once marched in procession. You can still climb the pyramids, your breath catching as you imagine incense smoke rising, drums pounding, crowds chanting, and you realize that long before Columbus, before even the Aztecs, there was already a city here that rivaled Rome and Beijing in grandeur, a city that proved the Americas were never empty, they were full, vibrant and cosmically alive. You leave the silent pyramids of Teotihuacan behind, and drift forward in time to the highlands of central Mexico, where another power rose, the Toltecs. By around 900 CE, centuries after Teotihuacan's fall, the Toltecs had built their own capital at Tula, sometimes called Tolan, and though their reign was shorter, their reputation echoed through history, amplified by the Aztecs who later mythologized them. To step into Tula is to see both the continuation of Mesoamerican traditions and the forging of new ones, centered around warriors, conquest, and the blending of myth and memory. You stand in Tula's central plaza, and the first thing you notice are the Atlantean figures, towering stone warrior columns, each about 15 feet tall, carved with stern faces, elaborate headdresses, and atlels, spear throwers clutched in their hands. They look like soldiers frozen in stone, guardians of the temple that once stood above them. Imagine sunlight striking their carved armor, obsidian inlays gleaming, the impression unmistakable. This was a city of warriors, disciplined, fierce and proud. Tula itself was smaller than Teotihuacan, housing perhaps 30,000, 40,000 people, but its influence was outsized. Its plazas, pyramids, ball courts, and palaces show a society steeped in both ritual and militarism. Murals once painted on walls depicted jaguars and coyotes devouring human hearts, a not-so-subtle reminder of the city's ideology. War wasn't just politics, it was sacred duty, a means of feeding both gods and empire. You glance nervously at your chest, suddenly aware that in this society your heart might be considered a snack. The Toltec pantheon reflected this martial ethos. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, played a central role, symbolizing both wisdom and rulership, but so did Tezcatlipoca, the smoky mirror, a god of war, sorcery, and fate. The tension between these two deities mirrored broader cultural struggles between peace and war, order and chaos, creation and destruction. Later Aztec legends would spin this as stories of rival priest-kings. Quetzalcoatl, cast as a benevolent, wise ruler eventually overthrown and exiled, fated to return. Whether these tales reflect real Toltec history or Aztec mythmaking doesn't matter as much as their legacy. The Toltecs became a model of what it meant to be powerful, refined and feared. Daily life in Tula revolved around maize agriculture, trade, and craft production. Farmers cultivated fields on the surrounding plains, while artisans specialized in obsidian tools, textiles, and featherwork. Trade connected them to faraway regions: turquoise from the American Southwest, cacao from the South, shells from the coasts. Tula was not an isolated city, it was plugged into a continental web of exchange. Imagine marketplaces bustling with goods, merchants haggling, children tugging at their mothers' skirts for a sweet treat of roasted cacao, and then overhead the shadow of militarism loomed, reminding everyone that prosperity depended on both commerce and conquest. The Toltecs also built ball courts, where the sacred Mesoamerican ball game played out. Warriors in padded gear slammed heavy rubber balls with hips and forearms, while spectators cheered, gambled and watched for the ritual meanings in every bounce. The ball game wasn't just sport, it was myth made physical, a contest symbolizing cosmic battles. In some cases, losing teams or winning captains might be sacrificed, their blood feeding the gods who kept the sun rising. You're not sure whether to cheer or cringe, but you know you wouldn't last a single round with that heavy ball bruising your ribs. The city's architecture also carried messages. The main ceremonial precinct included Pyramid B, topped with a temple once supported by those Atlantean warrior columns. Serpent heads and jaguar reliefs adorned staircases, reminding you that power was animal, divine and violent. Smaller temples and palaces surrounded the core, their walls decorated with images of marching warriors and predatory animals. Walking through these spaces, you feel the ideology pressing in on you. This is a city where might is sacred, and violence is a pathway to divinity. But like Teotihuacan before it, Tula's glory did not last. By around 1150 CE, the city began to decline, possibly due to drought, internal strife, or attacks from nomadic groups pressing into the highlands. Its plazas emptied, its warrior columns stood sentinel over ruins, and yet in death, Tula's reputation grew. Centuries later, the Aztecs would look back at the Toltecs as paragons of culture, wisdom, and power. They even claimed descent from Toltec rulers, using that mythic lineage to legitimize their own empire. To the Aztecs, Toltec became synonymous with refinement and artistry, the gold standard of civilization. It's a bit like how later Europeans idolized the Romans. By the time the Aztecs ruled Tenochtitlan, Tula was long abandoned, but its memory loomed so large that to be Toltec meant to be a master of knowledge and craft. The irony is thick. A city that fell after only a few centuries became the eternal benchmark for greatness. That's like if your local startup fizzled after 10 years, but 2 centuries later, everyone insisted it had invented civilization. Archaeology today confirms both the grandeur and the brutality of Tula. Excavations reveal evidence of complex social hierarchy, artistic achievements and long-distance trade, but also ritual sacrifice, militarism, and the harsh realities of maintaining power through fear. You can almost hear the echoes, the clash of obsidian blades, the roar of crowds in the ball court, the chants rising in smoky plazas, and you realize the Toltecs were both real and imagined, a people who built in stone, and who lived forever in myth. Here's your cheeky takeaway. If you lived in Tula, your life choices boiled down to farmer breaking your back in the fields, or warrior risking your head on the battlefield. Either way, your contribution to the cosmos was measured in maize and blood. Not exactly a cozy 9 to 5, but hey, at least the feathered headdresses were fabulous. As you leave Tula, the stone warriors still stand tall, staring into the horizon. They've watched centuries pass, myths grow, and empires rise and fall, and you realize that in their silent, stony gaze lies the essence of the Toltec legacy, power carved into permanence, remembered not just for what it was but for what others believed it to be. You walk further into the Valley of Mexico, and suddenly the landscape shifts into shimmering water and floating gardens. Here, in the early 1300s, a new power rose from exile, and built one of the most extraordinary cities the world had ever seen, the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. To step into this city, at its height in the early 1500s, is to enter a place that stunned, even hardened Spanish conquistadors. Its size, its beauty, its sheer order. Imagine a city of perhaps 200,000 people, more than London or Paris at the time, rising out of the lake like a vision. Tenochtitlan began humbly. The Mexica people, later known as the Aztecs, arrived in the valley as outsiders, dismissed by more powerful neighbors. Legend says they wandered until they found a sign foretold by prophecy, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. There on swampy islands of Lake Texcoco, they settled. Most people would have taken one look at the marshy waterlogged land and thought absolutely not. The Mexica thought, perfect. With ingenuity they transformed it into a metropolis. They built chinampas, raised fields constructed by piling mud, vegetation, and lake sediment into rectangular platforms anchored by trees. These floating gardens, crisscrossed by canals, produced astonishing amounts of maize, beans, squash, chili peppers, and flowers. From above, it must have looked like a checkerboard of green floating on blue. Canals served as highways for canoes carrying goods, while causeways linked the city to the mainland. Water was controlled through aqueducts, bringing fresh spring water from distant hills. Think about that, a city on a lake with functioning canals, aqueducts and gardens, centuries before modern plumbing, and you're still struggling with your leaky sink. At the city's heart stood the Templo Mayor, the great temple, a double pyramid crowned with twin shrines, one to Tlaloc, the rain god, and one to Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war. Imagine climbing its steep stairs as incense clouds swirl, drums pound and the crowd roars below. At the top, priests in elaborate regalia performed rituals, sometimes including human sacrifice. To the Aztecs, these acts weren't cruelty, they were cosmic necessity. The sun needed nourishment in the form of blood, or it would falter and plunge the world into darkness. Every heart cut from a chest, every drop of blood spilled, was fuel for the universe. Sobering, yes, but it was their truth, woven into the fabric of their worldview. The scale of sacrifice at Tenochtitlan could be staggering. Accounts tell of thousands of captives sacrificed at the dedication of the Templo Mayor in the 1480s. Scholars debate the exact numbers. Were they exaggerated by Spanish chroniclers, eager to paint the Aztecs as barbaric? Perhaps, but even conservative estimates suggest hundreds, and that's still enough to chill your spine. Picture the plaza awash with chanting, the smell of copal incense mixed with iron-rich blood, the crowd surging with awe and fear. You'd be standing there thinking, please don't call my name. But Aztec society wasn't only about blood and war, it was highly organized, with schools for children, yes, even commoners, markets that amazed Europeans with their size and order, and a political system that combined hereditary nobility with meritocratic advancement. At the great market of Tlatelolco, tens of thousands gathered daily. Imagine rows of stalls offering maize tamales, cacao beans, obsidian blades, jaguar pelts, parrot feathers, woven cloth, and even slaves. The noise of haggling, the smell of roasting maize and chili, the clatter of canoes unloading goods. It was an economic engine that kept the empire running. When the Spaniards first saw it, they compared it to the finest markets of Europe. Education was a hallmark of Aztec society. Boys trained for warfare or priesthood, girls in household skills, midwifery, or weaving. Nobles studied history, astronomy, and rhetoric, learning how to command through words as much as through arms. The Aztec Empire wasn't just brute force, it was culture, poetry, philosophy. Their poets wrote verses about life's fragility, about the fleeting beauty of flowers and songs. We only come to sleep, we only come to dream, one poem mused. For a people so associated with sacrifice, there was also a deep awareness of life's tenderness. Still, warfare lay at the heart of the Aztec system. Expansion was constant, driven by the need for tribute and captives. Conquered regions sent textiles, cacao, feathers, and maize to Tenochtitlan. Tribute lists carved in stone read like tax documents of empire. If you lived under Aztec rule, your life involved paying goods and labor, and sometimes sending your young men as warriors or sacrifices. Refusal brought war, swift and punishing. The so-called flower wars were staged battles designed not to capture territory but captives for sacrifice. Imagine marching into combat, knowing your enemy wasn't necessarily aiming to kill you, they wanted to take you alive. That's a different level of terrifying. Art and architecture flourished alongside war. The Aztecs carved intricate stone sculptures, produced codices painted with vibrant pigments, and created feather mosaics, so fine they shimmered like liquid light. Their songs and poetry survive, filled with reflections on fate, death and the gods. The duality of beauty and brutality is everywhere. A dazzling turquoise mosaic mask, perhaps once worn by a priest during a ritual drenched in blood. Daily life for commoners, centered on the Calpoli, neighborhood units where families shared land and responsibilities. Women ground maize daily, turning it into tortillas, tamales, and atole drinks. Men farmed, built and fought. Festivals punctuated the year with dances, feasts and rituals tied to the 2060-day sacred calendar. Children laughed, dogs barked, markets bustled. Life wasn't all blood and sacrifice, it was ordinary humanity too, lived within the rhythms of an extraordinary city. And then came 1519. Hernán Cortés and his Spanish expedition marched into the Valley of Mexico. When they reached Tenochtitlan, even hardened soldiers gasped. They saw gleaming temples, broad causeways, bustling markets. They compared it to Venice, with its canals and shimmering waters, but admiration quickly turned to conquest. The Spaniards allied with subject peoples resentful of Aztec tribute demands, and within 2 years, Tenochtitlan was besieged, burned, and shattered. The lake was drained, the temples toppled, the canals filled. From its ashes Mexico City rose. Yet even in conquest, the Aztec legacy endured. Their agricultural techniques, their poetry, their myths, and their symbols survived, carried by descendants who still honor their ancestors. The eagle and cactus prophecy lives on in Mexico's national flag. Nahuatl, the Aztec language, is still spoken by over 1 million people. Their memory, like their city, floats eternal on the lake of history. Here's your cheeky thought: if you'd lived in Tenochtitlan, your day might have involved paddling a canoe to the market, bargaining for chilies, attending a festival, and then nervously checking the temple steps to see if your cousin's name had come up for sacrifice. Stressful, yes, but also vibrant, colorful, and cosmically charged. As you leave, you glance back across the lake, The sun sets behind the twin shrines of the Templo Mayor, their silhouettes black against a crimson sky. You hear drums, laughter, chants, and the splash of paddles, and you realize that before Columbus, there already existed a city here that made Europe's capitals look small, a city where maize and blood, poetry and war, order and chaos wove together into one of the greatest civilizations of the Americas. You turn south and a little east, into the rugged valleys and mountains of Oaxaca, where another civilization thrived for more than 1,000 years, the Zapotecs, and later the Mixtecs. These peoples built cities on mountaintops, carved codices filled with their histories, and buried their rulers with treasures so dazzling that centuries later they still leave archaeologists blinking in disbelief. If you thought the Maya and Aztecs had a monopoly on sophistication, prepare to be surprised. Oaxaca's civilizations were equally refined, equally complex, and left legacies that still ripple through time. At the heart of the Zapotec world was Monte Alban, perched high on a flattened mountaintop overlooking the Oaxaca Valley. Imagine the effort. Workers literally cut off the peak of a mountain to create a flat space, then filled it with plazas, temples, ball courts, and palaces. From here rulers could look out over the entire valley, a constant reminder to everyone below of who held power. You climb the steps into the main plaza, the wind whipping across the mountaintop, the sun blazing down, and you see rows of stone buildings arranged in symmetry. The silence is deceptive. 1,000 years ago, this was the beating heart of Zapotec power. Monte Alban wasn't just a ceremonial center, it was a planned city with tens of thousands of residents. Houses spread down the slopes, terraces supported fields, and roads connected communities across the valley. The Zapotec developed one of the earliest known writing systems in the Americas, glyphs carved into stone slabs, recording names, conquests, and rituals. Some stelae show upside-down figures, thought to represent defeated enemies, their fates immortalized as warnings. Imagine being a rival leader and seeing your likeness carved forever as a fallen captive. Not great for your self-esteem. Religion permeated Zapotec life. Their pantheon included gods of rain, maize, fertility, and lightning. Cotigo, the storm god, loomed large, often depicted with jaguar features and serpent tongues. Priests performed rituals to ensure rain and fertility, their ceremonies marked by incense, chants, and bloodletting. The cycles of agriculture were tied to cycles of the cosmos, and Monte Alban's temples aligned with celestial events, much like other Mesoamerican centers. Here too, architecture was cosmology, stone reshaped into a mirror of the heavens. The ball game was central to ritual life. At Monte Alban's ball courts, players hurled a heavy rubber ball, keeping it in play with hips and forearms, reenacting cosmic struggles. Victories and defeats carried religious significance, sometimes ending in sacrifice. Imagine the roar of the crowd, the thud of the ball against stone, the tension as warriors fought not just for points but for honor and destiny, and you thought your weekend soccer match was intense. Burials at Monte Alban reveal a stratified society. Elites rested in tombs filled with jade, gold, ceramics, and intricate mosaics. One of the most famous discoveries came later when the Mixtecs controlled the city. Tomb 7, excavated in the 1930s, yielded a treasure trove of gold masks, turquoise mosaics, pearl necklaces, and carved bone. The richness stunned the world, proving that Oaxaca's peoples were masters of artistry and symbolism. Each item wasn't just wealth, it was meaning, crafted to accompany the dead into the next world. By around 750 CE, Monte Alban began to decline, political power fragmented, populations shifted, and new centers rose. Among them were the Mixtecs, who dominated Oaxaca from about 900 CE onward. The Mixtecs inherited and reinterpreted Zapotec traditions, developing their own distinctive culture. They are particularly famous for their codices, screenfold books made of deerskin, painted with glyphs and images. These codices tell dynastic histories, genealogies, alliances, and wars, often stretching across centuries. Imagine flipping through one: bright colors, stylized figures, and narrative scenes unfolding without words. It's a history book, an art gallery, and a family tree rolled into one. Mixtec politics revolved around city-states, often locked in rivalries and alliances. Rulers married strategically, waged wars, and claimed descent from divine ancestors. One of the most legendary figures was Lord 8 Deer Jaguar Claw, a Mixtec king whose exploits are recorded in codices. His life was filled with battles, alliances, betrayals, and rituals, making him sound like a character out of epic literature. The fact that his story still resonates a millennium later speaks to the power of Mixtec historical consciousness. Artistry was central to Mixtec identity. Their goldsmiths produced objects of astonishing delicacy: pendants, masks, pectorals, crafted with filigree and inlay, turquoise mosaics, shimmered with blues and greens, arranged into patterns that glowed in firelight. Bone carvings told stories in miniature, their surfaces etched with glyphs and symbols. These were not mere luxuries, they were embodiments of cosmic power, worn by rulers to display their divine authority. If you've ever struggled to thread a needle, picture someone carving a story into bone with stone tools, and you'll appreciate the patience involved. Religion here, as elsewhere, tied human fate to divine will. The Mixtecs believed their rulers were descended from gods, their rituals sustaining the balance of the universe. Sacrifice, human and animal, played a role in maintaining cosmic order. Priests guided ceremonies, diviners read omens, and rituals marked births, marriages, wars and harvests. Festivals filled plazas with dancers in elaborate costumes, masks gleaming, feathers swaying, drums thundering. Life was rhythm and spectacle, a constant dialogue with the sacred. Yet the Mixtecs were not isolated. They traded widely, connecting Oaxaca to the broader Mesoamerican world. Cacao, jade, feathers, obsidian, all passed through their hands. Alliances linked them to neighboring powers, including the Aztecs, who eventually conquered parts of Oaxaca in the 15th century. But the Mixtecs remained resilient, their artistry and traditions enduring even under imperial rule. When the Spanish arrived in the 1520s, they encountered a land already layered with centuries of complexity. They burned many codices, seeing them as pagan, but a handful survived, preserving priceless windows into Mixtec thought. Imagine those fragile pages surviving fire and conquest, carrying the voices of rulers and scribes across the centuries. Today, those codices sit in European museums, silent witnesses to a civilization that refused to be forgotten. Here's your reality check. If you'd lived in Oaxaca 1,000 years ago, you might have been hauling stones up a mountain to expand Monte Alban, painting glyphs onto a deerskin codex, or nervously watching the ball game to see if your cousin would make it out alive. Hard work, constant ritual, and the occasional chance of ending up in a sacrificial ceremony, yet you'd also be part of a society producing some of the most exquisite art the world has ever seen. Your jewelry, your codices, your tomb treasures, these would outlast empires. As you leave Oaxaca's mountaintops, you glance back at Monte Alban. Its plaza's quiet now but still commanding. The wind sweeps across the stones carrying whispers of prayers, chants and songs. You realize the Zapotec and Mixtec weren't side notes in Mesoamerican history. They were central chapters, their legacies carved into mountains, painted into codices, and gilded in gold. And even now, in the valleys below, their descendants still farm, speak their languages, and dance their festivals, keeping the ancient rhythms alive. You leave Oaxaca behind, crossing mountains into the western highlands of Mexico. Here, amid volcanic valleys and lakes, another kingdom flourished in the shadow of Aztec power, the Purepeca, also known as the Tarascans. While less well known than their Aztec neighbors, they created a state every bit as sophisticated, and in some ways, more technologically advanced. When the Aztecs expanded their empire in the 15th century, they conquered wide swaths of Mesoamerica, but never the Purepeca heartland. That alone should make you pause. If the Aztecs were the heavyweight champions, the Purepeca were the one opponent they couldn't knock out. Their capital was Tzintzuntzan, perched on the banks of Lake Pátzcuaro in modern Michoacán. Picture it, shimmering waters, fishing canoes gliding across the lake, mountains looming in the distance. Rising above the landscape were the city's distinctive temples, called yacatas. Massive platforms built of stone, shaped in semicircles or rectangles, lined up along a ridge. From above they look like architectural puzzles, unlike anything built by the Maya or Aztecs. Priests climbed these structures to perform rituals, their chants drifting over the lake, mingling with the cries of waterbirds. The Purepeca state was highly centralized. Their ruler, called the Cazensi, commanded authority over a confederation of towns and provinces. Tribute flowed in: maize, cotton, obsidian, feathers, fish, and slaves. But here's what really set them apart: metallurgy. While the Aztecs and Maya worked gold and silver mainly for ornament, the Purepeca developed advanced metalworking techniques, including the production of copper and bronze tools and weapons. Imagine warriors armed not just with obsidian blades, but with copper axes, their edges gleaming in the sun. It gave them a technological edge. the Aztecs respected and feared. Daily life revolved around maize agriculture, fishing, and craft production. Farmers cultivated fields in the valleys, while fishermen cast nets and used butterfly-shaped nets to catch whitefish in Lake Pátzcuaro. Artisans crafted fine pottery, textiles, and featherwork. Metal workers hammered copper bells that jingled during dances, creating a sound both festive and sacred. Imagine a festival night, fires flickering, dancers whirling with bells ringing in rhythm, the whole plaza alive with sound and light. Religion here, as everywhere, shaped identity. The Purépecha pantheon included gods of fire, the sun, rain, and war. Their main deity, Curicari, was a fire and sun god, whose worship involved elaborate ceremonies. Priests tended sacred flames, sacrifices were offered, and rituals bound the people to their cosmic order. Temples atop yacatas were centers of both religion and politics, their rituals reinforcing the Kazantzis' authority. One striking feature of Purépecha society was its military organization. Unlike the Aztecs, who expanded constantly through tribute and war, the Purépecha maintained a powerful defensive stance. When Aztec armies marched west, they were repelled, suffering defeats that kept them from conquering Michoacán. This resistance wasn't luck, it was strategy, technology, and the fierce cohesion of a people determined to remain independent. To the Aztecs, the Purépecha were both rivals and trading partners. Tribute lists mention copper tools and bells flowing into the Valley of Mexico, evidence of grudging respect. Yet Purépecha life wasn't all war and politics. Their society valued music, dance, and festivals. Chronicles described ceremonies where nobles and commoners alike participated, offerings laid out in plazas, dancers moving in time to drums, shells, and bells. Food flowed freely, tamales, beans, roasted fish. Children laughed, vendors hawked goods, and the air shimmered with smoke and song. If you closed your eyes, you might make it for any great festival anywhere in the world, except here. Every rhythm carried sacred weight. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, the Purépecha kingdom was still strong. Unlike the Aztecs, they did not fight long against the invaders. Their last Kazantzi, Tangaxuan II, chose diplomacy, submitting to Spanish authority and offering tribute. For a time this spared them the devastation suffered by Tenochtitlan, but Spanish greed soon caught up. Tangaxuan was accused of rebellion and executed by Nuño de Guzmán in 1530, his death plunging the region into chaos. It was a bitter end for a kingdom that had stood independent for centuries. Still, the Purépecha legacy endures. Their language is still spoken today, their crafts, especially copperwork, still practiced. Festivals in Michoacán still echo with the rhythms of ancient dances, masks, and bells, carrying forward traditions rooted in pre-Columbian times. Their refusal to bow to Aztec domination, their mastery of metal, and their distinctive architecture mark them as one of the great civilizations of the Americas. Here's your cheeky thought: if you lived in Centenson, your choices might have included fishing the lake at dawn, hammering copper bells until your ears rang, or standing on a yacata watching for Aztec armies on the horizon. Stressful, sure, but you'd also live in a society that could proudly say, "We kept the Aztecs out." Not many neighbors could make that claim. As you leave Lake Pátzcuaro, the temples still rise above the water, their stone forms catching the sunset. You imagine priests lighting sacred fires, warriors polishing copper axes, dancers ringing bells into the night, and you realize the Purépecha weren't just a footnote to Aztec glory. They were a civilization in their own right, strong enough to shape their destiny until the very end. The road carries you south, over rugged mountains and down into the spine of the Andes. Here, at dizzying altitudes where clouds scrape against jagged peaks, you step into the heart of the largest empire in pre-Columbian America, the Inca. From the early 1400s until the Spanish arrival in the 1530s, the Inca forged a realm that stretched for nearly 2,500 miles, from modern Colombia down through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. They ruled over some 10 million people, knit together by roads, bridges, and a bureaucracy so well organized that it astonishes historians today. If Cahokia was North America's giant, Teotihuacan Mesoamerica's colossus, then the Inca were South America's empire builders par excellence. At the heart of this empire lay Cusco, the navel of the world. Imagine descending into the valley and seeing its stone walls glinting in the sun, temples crowned with sheets of gold, and streets radiating like spokes from the Sacsayhuaman fortress above. Cusco wasn't just a city, it was the symbolic center of the universe. the Inca divided their empire into 4 quarters, all converging here. From this hub, messengers carried news, armies marched, and tribute flowed. To stand in Cusco was to stand at the axis of an empire. The emperor, the Sapien Inca, was more than a king, he was a god on earth, descended from Inti the sun god. Draped in fine textiles, adorned with gold and carried on litters, the Inca radiated authority. When he spoke, it was as if the sun itself gave command. His court was a theater of order and power, where nobles bowed, officials recorded tribute, and priests prepared offerings. Imagine standing in the plaza, the crowd parting as the Sapien Inca passed, sunlight flashing on his golden headband. You wouldn't just be seeing a ruler, you'd be seeing divinity in motion. But what held this vast empire together wasn't just charisma or conquest, it was infrastructure. The Inca built an astonishing road network, nearly 25,000 miles of paths cutting through mountains, deserts, and valleys. Suspension bridges of woven grass stretched across roaring gorges, so light they swayed in the wind, yet strong enough to bear armies. Relay runners, the chasquis, sprinted in shifts across these roads, carrying messages encoded in quipu knotted strings of different colors. With this system, information traveled hundreds of miles in days. Think of it as an empire-wide internet, except the bandwidth was human lungs and legs. And yes, you'd be panting halfway up the first hill. Agriculture underpinned everything. The Inca mastered terracing, carving fields into mountainsides like green staircases reaching to the sky. Channels diverted water, storage houses preserved surplus, and crops adapted to every altitude. Maize in valleys, potatoes in highlands, quinoa in plateaus, coca in tropical slopes. Lemurs and alpacas carried loads, provided wool, and occasionally meat. The variety was staggering, a buffet created by geography and ingenuity. When droughts hit, state granaries released stores to feed the people. In return, the empire demanded labor, not money. Through the mita system, every subject owed service, building roads, serving in the army, working fields for the state. Your taxes were paid in sweat, and yes, that included lugging stones, the size of minivans up a mountainside. Speaking of stones, Inca masonry remains one of the world's marvels. Visit Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, or Sacsayhuaman, and you see walls of massive blocks fitted so tightly you can't slip a knife blade between them. No mortar, no cement, just precision. Some stones weigh over 100 tons, yet they were moved and set with tools no more advanced than lavers, ramps, and human effort. Stand before such walls, and you can't help but wonder how they did it. Aliens? No, just determination, geometry, and sheer backbreaking labor, and maybe a lot of yelling. Religion bound the empire together. Inti, the sun god, stood at the center, his temple in Cusco, the Coricancha, covered in sheets of gold. Inside, a golden disk reflected sunlight, symbolizing Inti's power. Priests tended sacred fires, festivals marked solstices, and processions carried offerings. Human sacrifice occurred, especially in Kapasaka rituals, where children were selected for their purity, adorned in finery, and taken to mountain tops. There, in the thin air, they were sacrificed to ensure harmony between gods and people. Sobering, yes, but also a testament to the weight of cosmic duty in Inca thought. Imagine trudging up a 20,000-foot peak, lungs burning, snow blinding, carrying offerings to lay at the edge of heaven. Inca society was hierarchical yet communal. Families lived in islas, kinship groups that shared land and labor. Nobles enjoyed fine clothing, coca leaves, and elaborate feasts, while commoners worked fields, wove textiles, and raised animals. Textiles, more than gold, were the true measure of wealth. Cloth marked status, sealed alliances, and clothed armies. Women weaving in courtyards weren't just making garments, they were producing political currency. Festivals punctuated the year, the most famous being Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. At the winter solstice, thousands gathered in Cusco, priests watched the sunrise, sacrifices were offered, dances whirled and feasts flowed. Imagine the sound of drums echoing off stone walls, the air thick with smoke and roasted maize, the crowd surging with reverence. It was both cosmic renewal and social theater, reminding everyone that their lives were bound to the sun's eternal journey. The Inca also excelled in administration. They organized populations into decimal units, groups of 10, 100, 1,000, each with overseers. Census takers used quipu to record tribute, births, deaths, and labor. Officials rotated to prevent corruption. Storehouses lined the roads, filled with maize, potatoes, cloth, weapons, ready for redistribution. It was a bureaucracy that would make modern governments jealous, efficient, pervasive, and of course demanding. Yet for all its power, the empire was young and brittle when the Spanish arrived. Civil war between the brothers Atahualpa and Huascar weakened the state. When Pizarro landed with a few hundred men, he found an empire already strained. Through deception, alliances and disease, the Spaniards toppled what had taken generations to build. Cusco fell, temples were looted, idols smashed, the Coricancha's golden walls were stripped bare. It was a conquest as shocking as it was swift. But the Inca legacy didn't vanish. Their roads still lace the Andes, their terraces still cling to mountains, their descendants still farm, weave and speak Quechua. Machu Picchu, hidden until the 20th century, stands as a ghostly reminder of their genius, its stones humming with memory. Tourists gasp at its beauty, llamas graze its terraces, and somewhere in the wind, you hear echoes of drums and flutes. Here's your cheeky reminder: if you lived as an Inca commoner, your life would involve endless labor, terraces to build, llamas to herd, potatoes to plant. Miss your quota, and the overseer would remind you that this wasn't optional. But if you were noble, draped in fine textiles and chewing coca while basking in the sun's glory, life might feel divine until smallpox or conquistadors arrived, of course. As you leave Cusco, the Andes stretch endlessly, snow-capped and silent. Yet every terrace, every road, every stone wall whispers of the empire that once ruled them. The Inca proved that even the harshest mountains, human will could carve order, beauty, and power. And though the empire fell, its people endure, their songs and languages still alive in the highland air.
You follow the long Inca roads back in time, deeper into the Andes, long before Cusco was crowned as the imperial heart. Here lie the foundations, earlier civilizations, whose brilliance shaped the Inca, and left legacies etched into deserts, valleys, and mountaintops. These pre-Inca cultures experimented with gods, art, agriculture, and architecture, centuries before the empire rose. Without them, there could have been no Inca Golden Age. And tonight, you're going to wander among them. Let's start with the Chevin, who thrived around 900 to 200 BCE in the highlands of northern Peru. Their ceremonial center, Chevin de Huanta, stands like a stone riddle in the mountains. You step into its labyrinthine passageways, torchlight flickering against carved stone walls. Images of jaguars, eagles and serpents leer at you, their forms merging into surreal hybrids. Priests here weren't just holy men, they were masters of psychological theater. Archaeologists believe they used hallucinogenic plants in ceremonies, leading initiates through twisting corridors while strange sounds echoed from hidden ducts. Imagine stumbling through the dark, vision blurred, hearing roars and whispers, and suddenly coming face to face with the Lansun, a massive fanged stone idol gleaming in torchlight. If the goal was to convince you the gods were real, it worked. From the Chavin flowed a legacy of religious iconography, uniting highland and coastal peoples with a shared set of symbols: jaguar fangs, serpent coils, condor wings. These motifs reappeared for centuries. The Chavin built not empires but ideas, weaving together a spiritual vocabulary that echoed long after their temples fell silent. Now move forward a millennium to the Nazca on Peru's southern coast, 2000 BCE, 600 CE. Here the desert itself became a canvas. From the ground it looks barren, but climb a nearby hillside, or better, imagine hovering in the sky and you see enormous geoglyphs etched into the earth: monkeys with spiraling tails, hummingbirds with outstretched wings, spiders with endless legs. Some stretch hundreds of feet across, created by scraping away dark pebbles to reveal lighter soil beneath. They've endured for centuries in the dry climate. Were they ritual pathways, astronomical markers, or messages to the gods? Theories abound. You picture priests leading processions along the lines, chanting, offering water to the thirsty desert. To you, standing in the sand, they look like doodles of giants. But to the Nazca, they were sacred dialogues with forces far larger than themselves. The Nazca also mastered irrigation. They built Pucayos spiraling aqueducts that tapped underground water, still functioning today. In one of the world's driest deserts, they coaxed life from stone and sand, growing maize, beans, squash and cotton. Their pottery bursts with colors: reds, blacks, whites, showing stylized warriors, animals and deities. Hold a Nazca vessel, and you hold a piece of a worldview where every plant and beast shimmered with divine energy. Travel north again, to the Moche, 100,800 CE.
These coastal people built pyramids of adobe bricks, some towering hundreds of feet high. The Huaca del Sol, one of the largest, may have used more than 100 million bricks. Imagine standing at its base, walls rising like a man-made cliff. Inside, murals showed gods demanding blood, warriors parading prisoners, priests conducting sacrifices. The Moche didn't hide their brutality, they painted their pottery as equally vivid, sometimes shockingly so, realistic portraits of faces, detailed scenes of battle, and yes, explicit erotic imagery. Archaeologists call it Moche sex pottery, and it leaves little to the imagination. You glance at one and think, well, they definitely weren't shy. But the Moche weren't only about shock value, their irrigation systems fed lush fields, their artisans produced exquisite gold and silver jewelry, and their rulers staged ceremonies that bound society together. One burial, the Lord of Sapien, revealed treasures rivaling Egypt's pharaohs, gold scepters, turquoise ornaments, feather headdresses. He was buried with wives, guards and llamas, his tomb a microcosm of his power. Standing there you feel both awe and unease. This was wealth drenched in sacrifice. Further south, in the highlands near Lake Titicaca, the Tiwanaku civilization 500–1000 CE created monumental architecture at altitudes over 12,000 feet. Their gateway of the sun, carved from a single massive stone, depicts a central figure surrounded by winged attendants, a cosmic ruler of sky and earth. Imagine the effort of moving such stones across the altiplano, thin air biting your lungs, icy winds cutting your skin. The Tiwanaku mastered raised field agriculture, building platforms that absorbed heat by day and radiated warmth at night, protecting crops from frost. Their empire stretched across highland and coast, linking distant peoples through trade and ritual. To later Inca rulers, Tiwanaku was a place of origin, a sacred past to which they traced their legitimacy. Meanwhile, in the northern highlands, the Wari 600–1100 CE pioneered administrative strategies the Inca would later adopt. Their capital near modern Ayacucho sprawled with planned streets, storage facilities and compounds for officials. They built roads, managed agriculture, and expanded across diverse regions. The Wari were empire builders before the Inca, testing systems of control that would echo in later centuries. Walk their streets, and you feel the ghost of bureaucracy, quipu precursors, storage warehouses, overseers ensuring every community paid its due in labor and maize. It's like a rehearsal for the Inca stage. Each of these cultures added layers. The Chavin gave symbols, the Nazca gave lines, the Moche gave artistry and brutality, the Tiwanaku gave monumental vision, the Wari gave administration. By the time the Inca rose, they inherited a tapestry woven over millennia. When they built Cusco's walls, they were standing on the shoulders of Tiwanaku. When they organized Mita labor, they echoed the Wari. When they worshipped sun and earth, they were still hearing whispers of Chavin jaguars and Nazca hummingbirds. Here's your cheeky reminder: if you were plopped into the Andes at any point in this parade, chances are you'd be hauling stones, digging canals, or if unlucky, tied up for sacrifice. And yet, you'd also be surrounded by some of the most breathtaking creativity humans ever produced. Art so bold, architecture so enduring, and ideas so strange you'd be telling your descendants about them for centuries, if you survived. As you walk away from these pre-Inca worlds, the desert lines still stretch beneath your feet, the adobe pyramids still crumble against the sky, and the highland gateways still stand against icy winds. These were not footnotes, they were full civilizations, rich and inventive, proving again and again that the Americas were never silent, never empty. They were alive, layered with voices, preparing the stage for the empire that would one day call itself Inca. You drift eastward now, leaving the high stone terraces of the Andes and descending into a realm very different from mountains or deserts, the vast green expanse of the Amazon basin. For centuries, Europeans imagined this rainforest as a pristine wilderness, untouched by human hands until explorers stumbled upon it. But the truth is far stranger and far richer. Beneath the dense canopy and winding rivers, evidence points to large, organized societies that thrived long before Columbus. Their traces linger in soil, in forest patterns and in mysterious earthworks that only reveal themselves from above. The first clue comes from the ground itself. Much of the Amazon's soil is poor, quickly leached of nutrients by heavy rains, yet scattered across the basin are patches of terra preta, black earth. Unlike the thin surrounding soil, terra preta is dark, rich and fertile, created by people mixing charcoal, bone, pottery shards and organic matter over centuries. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate agricultural innovations. Imagine families tending gardens, tossing in food scraps, ash from hearth fires, and broken pots, slowly transforming dirt into living soil. Modern scientists still struggle to replicate it. You're looking at sustainable agriculture on a massive scale, proof that ancient Amazonians weren't just scraping by, they were engineering the land. From fertile fields came food, manioc, maize, squash, and a dizzying array of fruits. They cultivated palms for nuts, oils, and fibers. They managed forests like orchards, encouraging useful species while discouraging others. When you see a grove of Brazil nut trees today, chances are it's the remnant of human design, not natural accident. The Amazon, in other words, wasn't untouched wilderness, it was a managed garden sculpted over generations. And then there are the earthworks. In the upper Amazon, especially in what is now Brazil and Bolivia, archaeologists have uncovered geoglyphs, massive geometric designs, carved into the earth, visible only from the air. Circles, squares, rings, and lines stretch across miles. Some are ditches, others embankments, often with roads radiating outward. Built centuries before Europeans arrived, they suggest large, organized communities, coordinating labor on a grand scale. Picture workers digging trenches in the humid heat, insects buzzing, sweat soaking their clothes, all to inscribe cosmic patterns into the ground. Were they ceremonial centers, gathering places, or even territorial markers? Whatever their purpose, they tell you this: the rainforest held cities, not just scattered huts. Along rivers, people built raised fields and causeways. In the Llanos de Mocos of Bolivia, a savanna flooded seasonally. Ancient farmers created thousands of raised platforms, linked by canals and causeways. From above, it looks like a giant circuit board carved into the land. These fields let them farm even during floods, producing surplus food for dense populations. Imagine standing there centuries ago, water glistening around elevated fields, smoke rising from villages on high ground, canoes gliding through canals. It's not wilderness, it's landscape architecture on a continental scale. Fishing sustained life as much as farming. The Amazon's rivers teemed with fish, and ancient communities built fish weirs, stone or wooden barriers that funneled fish into traps. During seasonal migrations, schools would swim into these traps by the thousands, providing feasts and dried stores. If you've ever fumbled with a fishing rod for hours with no luck, imagine entire communities pulling in nets, so heavy with fish they nearly snap. Dinner was never guaranteed in the rainforest, but ingenuity made it far more likely. What about religion and ritual? We don't have towering stone temples here, but we do have hints. Ceramics show painted deities, animal spirits, and shamanic figures. Burial mounds suggest reverence for ancestors. Shamans likely guided rituals with the aid of hallucinogens from vines and plants. The ayahuasca being the most famous, still used today. Imagine night falling, villagers gathering in a clearing, the air thick with smoke and chanting, visions blooming as stars flicker overhead. The rainforest wasn't just a place to survive, it was alive with spirits, every tree and river infused with meaning. And then there were the networks. The Amazon may seem impenetrable, but its rivers are highways. Communities hundreds of miles apart exchanged goods, pottery styles, shells, feathers, even stone from distant quarries. Archaeologists find Amazonian feathers in the Andes, and Andean artifacts deep in the jungle. Canoes slid silently down rivers, paddlers, strong and swift, their cargoes carrying not just goods but stories. The sheer scale of these societies is still being uncovered. Some estimates suggest millions lived in the basin before European contact. When Spanish explorers like Francisco de Orellana journeyed down the Amazon in the 1540s, they described large towns along the riverbanks, filled with thousands of people. For centuries historians dismissed these accounts as exaggeration, but archaeology now suggests Orellana wasn't lying. The towns were real, later erased by disease and time. The rainforest you see today may be regrown, a ghost forest covering the traces of vanished civilizations. Think of the irony. Europeans imagined the Amazon as a wilderness, precisely because they had already destroyed its cities. Smallpox, influenza, and other diseases swept through after first contact, killing an estimated 80–90% of the population. Villages emptied, fields lay fallow, canals clogged, earthworks disappeared under vines. By the time later explorers came, they saw only forest, assuming it had always been that way. But the silence was not ancient, it was new, born of catastrophe. Daily life in these societies was still human, still ordinary. Families cooked manioc bread on clay griddles, fished with nets, wove hammocks from palm fibers, and painted their bodies with red and black dyes. Children played near the water, hunters returned with monkeys or birds, elders told stories of spirits and ancestors. The rainforest could be harsh, mosquitoes, snakes, floods, but it was also abundant. You imagine yourself there, swinging lazily in a hammock after a long day. Cicadas buzzing, smoke rising from cooking fires, the river reflecting stars. Peaceful until your neighbor reminds you it's your turn to haul mud for the raised field tomorrow. Here's your cheeky reminder: if you lived in the Amazon centuries ago, you'd be a mix of farmer, fisher, and construction worker, sweating buckets while mosquitoes feasted on you. But you'd also be part of a civilization that could turn forest into farmland, rivers into highways, and soil into living fertility that still endures today. Compare that to your houseplant that died last week, and you realize just how skilled these people were. As you leave the rainforest, the hum of insects fades, but the vision of ancient Amazonian cities lingers. They may not have left stone pyramids, but they left marks just as enduring: dark soils, forest orchards, earthworks etched into the land. The jungle isn't empty, it remembers, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear the voices of millions who once called it home, their legacy hidden in the green heart of the continent. You leave the rainforest's humid breath behind, and return to the broader sweep of the Americas, where civilizations have risen and fallen like the tides. By now you've walked through mounds, pyramids, roads, terraces and floating gardens, but civilizations don't last forever. Tonight you step into the twilight hours of these worlds, into the moments when they began to waver, falter, and collapse. This isn't just one fall, it's many. The story of pre-Columbian America is full of rises and declines, sparks of brilliance followed by silence, only to give way to new beginnings. Let's start in North America, with Cahokia. Around 1200 CE, its population may have reached 20,000, but within a century, the city began to unravel. Evidence shows deforestation, flooding, crop failures. Skeletons reveal signs of malnutrition, violence, and disease. The climate was shifting, colder, wetter, less predictable. Imagine being a farmer on Cahokia's outskirts, watching your maize wither under relentless rain, while leaders still demanded labor for rituals. At some point, faith in divine chiefs cracked. By 1350 the great plazas emptied, the mounds eroded, and Cahokia became ghost earth. The descendants of its people carried traditions forward, but the city itself vanished into silence. In the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans also faced collapse. Chaco Canyon, with its massive great houses and astronomical alignments, thrived for centuries, but by the 1200s, drought struck hard, crops failed, water dried up, and people abandoned the canyon. Many moved into cliff dwellings like Mesa Verde, defensible but temporary. When droughts worsened, even those sites were left behind. Puebloan descendants survived, but the grand architecture of Chaco and Mesa Verde was never revived. To walk those canyons today is to see walls still standing, but hear only wind where once drums echoed. Mesoamerica saw similar cycles. The classic Maya collapse around 900 CE left once great cities like Tikal and Copan swallowed by jungle. Theories range from drought and overpopulation to constant warfare and ecological strain. Imagine living in Tikal at the end, kings still demanding bloodletting rituals, while fields dried and wars dragged on. Slowly, people drifted away, temples fell quiet, plazas emptied, and the forest crept back, root by root, stone by stone. Yet the Maya people endured, shifting north to cities like Chichen Itza, then later resisting Spanish conquest in fierce, stubborn pockets. Civilization collapsed, but culture survived. Even Teotihuacan, the city of gods, fell. By 600 CE, fires tore through elite compounds, murals were smashed, and temples looted. Did internal revolt topple the rulers? Did trade routes shift, leaving the city to starve? The people dispersed, the pyramids stood empty, and for centuries the valley echoed only with myths. Later peoples, seeing its ruins, believed gods had created the world there. Collapse gave way to legend. The Toltecs at Tula also collapsed by 1150 CE. Their warrior columns left to watch over ruins. Drought may have played a role, as did invasions from northern groups. But the Aztecs, centuries later, turned Tula into myth, imagining it as the golden age from which their own lineage sprang. In collapse, the Toltecs became larger than life. The Aztec Empire, however, fell with brutal swiftness. In 1519, Hernán Cortés marched into the Valley of Mexico. Within 2 years, with allies and smallpox, he toppled Tenochtitlan. Imagine watching as your city of canals and gardens, of temples and markets, burned and crumbled under Spanish cannons and disease. Survivors stumbled through ash and corpses, but even then, traditions lived on. Songs, foods, language, Nahuatl is still spoken today. The eagle on the cactus still graces Mexico's flag. Collapse didn't erase, it transformed. South America tells the same story in grand, tragic arcs. The Moche collapsed after floods and droughts, their irrigation destroyed, their authority questioned. The Nazca lines lost meaning as societies fractured. Tiwanaku faded under climate shifts, its raised fields abandoned. The Wari crumbled after centuries of expansion, their roads left untended. Each time, environmental stress, warfare and social upheaval wove together into unraveling. And then the Inca, the greatest empire of the Andes, fell almost overnight. Civil war between Atahualpa and Huasca tore the empire apart. When Pizarro arrived with a few hundred men, he exploited the division. At Cajamarca in 1532, Atahualpa was captured in a single stroke, his armies stunned into paralysis. Within a few years, the empire crumbled, cities looted, temples stripped, people enslaved. It wasn't just steel and guns that destroyed the Inca, it was smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases spread ahead of the Spanish, killing millions before contact. Imagine entire villages collapsing in silence, fields untended, granaries untouched, the dead outnumbered the living, and the empire never recovered. The Amazon, too, collapsed under invisible assault. When Francisco de Orellana floated down the river in 1541, he described towns with thousands of people, fields stretching for miles, markets buzzing with life. Later explorers, a century after, found only silence. Europeans dismissed Orellana as a liar, assuming the rainforest had always been empty. In reality, disease had swept through unseen, reducing millions to memories. The forest regrew, swallowing fields and causeways, covering the scars of collapse. What explorers saw wasn't wilderness, it was aftermath. But collapse is never total. The descendants of every one of these civilizations still live. Puebloans in the American Southwest still dance in kivas, still tell stories of migration. Maya farmers in Guatemala still plant maize with rituals echoing their ancestors. Zapotec and Mixtec communities still celebrate festivals rooted in ancient rhythms. Purepeca craftspeople still hammer copper in Michoacán. Quechua-speaking villagers in the Andes still farm terraces carved by their forebears. Collapse never erased identity, it reshaped it. If you step back, a pattern emerges. Civilizations rose, flourished, and fell, often under the weight of their own success. Populations grew, resources strained, climates shifted, leaders demanded too much, enemies pressed too hard. Sometimes collapse came slowly, as with Cahokia or Chaco. Sometimes it came swiftly, as with Tenochtitlan or Cusco. And yet, in every case, people adapted. They didn't vanish. They moved, shifted, survived. Here's your cheeky reminder. Collapse looks glamorous in hindsight, ruins in the jungle, pyramids glowing in sunsets, but living through it, hunger, fear, uncertainty. If you were there, you wouldn't be admiring architecture, you'd be figuring out how to feed your kids when the rain stopped or when strange diseases swept through. It's a reality check that history isn't just monuments, it's survival. So as you wander these collapsed worlds, you realize something important. The story of the Americas before Columbus isn't just about cities rising, it's about resilience. People endured droughts, floods, wars, diseases, and conquests. They rebuilt, reimagined, remembered. Collapse wasn't an ending, it was a transformation, and the voices of those who endured still echo, carried in languages, foods, rituals, and the very landscapes shaped by their hands. The sun dips low now, and you find yourself at the threshold of one of history's most profound turning points, the moment when European sails appeared on American horizons. After tens of thousands of years of independent development, after millennia of experimentation with crops, cities, gods, and empires, the civilizations of the Americas faced a storm unlike any before. Tonight you step into those final decades before and after 1492, to see not only how European contact shattered worlds, but also how pieces endured, fragments of language, ritual and memory still alive today. When Columbus first landed in the Caribbean, he saw islands alive with people, The Taino cultivated cassava, maize and tobacco. They fished with nets, paddled swift canoes, and worshipped spirits called zemis, embodied in carved stone and wood idols. Villages bustled with trade, laughter and song, yet within decades, smallpox and slavery decimated them. The first collision set the pattern. Microbes killed more than muskets. To imagine it, picture whole villages emptying within weeks, elders gone, children orphaned, crops rotting. The silence must have been unbearable. On the mainland, Spaniards marched into lands already full of empires. In 1519, Cortés entered the Valley of Mexico. Tenochtitlan, with its causeways, canals and markets, stunned him. He saw order, beauty, and power, but also opportunity. With steel weapons, guns, horses and most of all, alliances with enemies of the Aztecs, Cortés toppled the city by 50. Imagine watching causeways littered with bodies, canals clogged with corpses, temples burning. The once great city of floating gardens became rubble, its survivors enslaved or forced into new colonial towns. In 1532, Pizarro faced the Inca. At Cajamarca, a few hundred Spaniards ambushed thousands of Inca soldiers. Cannons boomed, horses trampled, steel flashed. Atahualpa, the Supper Inca, was captured in minutes. Though he offered a ransom room filled with gold and silver, the Spaniards killed him anyway. Cusco soon fell, and with it, the heart of the empire. Imagine standing on those cobbled streets, watching conquistadors melt down golden idols into bars of bullion. For the Inca, it wasn't just conquest, it was desecration. But conquest wasn't only fire and swords, it was disease. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and plague swept faster than soldiers could march, killing millions who had never seen a European face. Historians estimate up to 90% of the population of the Americas died within a century of contact. Entire towns disappeared, entire languages vanished. It was one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history. Imagine the grief of survivors, the shock of seeing gods fail to protect them, the bewilderment of watching children die from invisible enemies. Yet amid devastation, survival endured. Pueblo peoples rebuilt in the southwest. Maya villages persisted in forests, resisting Spanish control for centuries. Zapotec, Mixtec, and Purepecha communities maintained languages, weaving traditions and festivals. In the Andes, Quechua and Aymara farmers still terraced mountains, still planted potatoes and quinoa. Even under colonial rule, people preserved rituals in disguise, blending Catholic saints with ancient gods. Festivals honoring the Virgin Mary carried echoes of maize mothers and sun deities. Drums still pounded, masks still danced, chants still rose, hidden in plain sight. Think of the foods you eat today: maize, potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, beans, chocolate. These are gifts of the Americas. When they crossed the Atlantic after 1492, they transformed the world. Italian cuisine without tomatoes, Irish stews without potatoes, Indian curries without chili peppers. Impossible. The so-called Columbian Exchange reshaped global diets and economies, making American crops the foundation of modern life. Every time you bite into fries or salsa, you're tasting legacies of civilizations that never truly died. And then there are the landscapes. Terra Preta in the Amazon still nurtures crops, Cahokia's mounds still rise above grass, Chaco's great houses still stand under desert skies, Nazca lines still sprawl across sand, Machu Picchu still clings to its ridge, llamas grazing its terraces. These aren't ruins frozen in the past, they are living testaments, reminders that the Americas were never empty but always full. But most enduring of all are the people. Millions of indigenous people across the Americas today speak ancestral languages, practice traditional rituals, and remember histories carried in story and song. In Mexico, Nahuatl remains alive, whispered in markets. In Guatemala, Maya weavers dye threads in colors, echoing ancient glyphs. In the Andes, Quechua farmers sing to mountain spirits before planting potatoes. In the Amazon, shamans drink ayahuasca to commune with the spirit world. Collapse never erased them. Colonization tried, but memory endured. Here's your cheeky reality check. If you'd lived through those first decades of contact, your life would have been chaos, disease spreading, strangers demanding tribute, old gods silent. You'd probably mutter that the end of the world had arrived. But 5 centuries later, your descendants might still be planting maize, telling stories and watching the sun rise over sacred mountains. Survival isn't glamorous, but it's powerful. So as the night winds down, you look back over the journey, from the mound builders of the Mississippi, to the cliff dwellers of the Southwest, from the Olmec colossal heads, to the Maya's stargazing kings, from Teotihuacan's pyramids, to the Toltec warriors, from Aztec markets, to Zapotec codices, from Purepeca copper, to Inca terraces, from Nazca lines to Amazonian orchards. The Americas were never silent, never waiting for discovery. They were full of life, imagination, and resilience. The lights dim, the drums fade, and the voices soften. You realize history isn't just about what was lost, it's about what survives. Every tortilla, every festival, every word in Nahuatl or Quechua or Maya is proof. Civilizations fell, yes, but people endure. And so, tonight you drift off not into silence, but into a chorus, millions of voices, ancient and modern, singing across time. The civilizations before Columbus are not gone, they are still here if you know how to listen. Now slow your breathing, let the images soften, the mounds blur into hills, the pyramids sink into jungle, the terraces fade into mist. Imagine the night sky stretching across the Americas, stars glimmering as they did for every people who ever lived here. Let their stories fade into calm whispers, carrying you gently toward rest. You are safe, you are part of a long human story, you carry it forward by remembering. Close your eyes, the fires burn low, the rivers run quiet, the stars keep watch. Sleep now, and let the ancient Americas hold you in their memory.